Right, so this morning we're talking about Broomfields, and I gather that there's at least a couple of people who are here who actually used to live in Broomfields, which is really quite fascinating. But this is an approximate idea of where we're talking about. So, roughly, you could say its boundaries were Croft Street to the north and west, so that's almost to the interchange. Wakefield Road to the north and east. It's very much a boundary now anyway today. There's a disused railway line that goes from Wakefield Road to the south and east. Top of Hall Lane to the south, and the current railway line to the west, give or take a few streets. Now this is approximate because Broomfields was never an official district. You know, it didn't have a parish council, it didn't have a ward for electing councillors or anything like that. It was an area that people talked about, but that is probably 99% accurate of what most people would say is Broomfields. Yeah, so there. It was never it never had official boundaries drawn up, and that was basically the same for all of the neighbourhoods that I'm going to talk about during these sessions, perhaps with the exception of maybe Ripleyville, because of it being a planned model urban village, and maybe Little Germany as well, which actually wasn't really a neighbourhood, it's the warehouse district. It's become a neighbourhood in more modern times, really. So, Broomfields. So it's southeastern edge of the city centre. So if you were to go back to 1840, it was basically it was a rural area. There was hardly any buildings whatsoever in the area. But by 1880, it was actually one of the most densely packed neighbourhoods in Bradford, and it had about 1,500 houses and about 8,000 people and lots of commercial premises squeezed into the area as well. So you go within a period of 40 years from practically nothing in an area to an area where in actual fact there was a shortage of land to build on because it was that developed by 1880. And there are reasons for it which we're going to talk about. Today it again has a very tiny population. There's only about a couple of hundred people live there, but the vast majority of the land in the area is now taken up by commercial organisations rather than by people's houses. So, the origins of Broomfields. Broomfields, because it wasn't an official district, the area we're talking about, a small portion of it was in the old Bradford borough and the rest of it was in the old Bowling borough before the two merged together. But the name comes from the northernmost part, which sometimes was referred to as the Broom Closes. The soils around the area were very clayey, and apparently that was very good for flowering broom. And that bit was within the old Bradford township. So that's basically where the name comes from, because of the flowering broom in the area. The southern area was in the small estate of Broom Hall. The area, before it was built on, was basically an attractive area to people. So people would catch trout in Bowling Beck, and it was said that the local Ladywell pool, the waters in there, had healing properties. So a lot of people would go there for, I suppose, recreation, really, you know, which you wouldn't do today, I would say. Now, because the soils were so clayey, and because of the topography of the area, so it was a very steep slope as you're going up what is now Hall Lane towards East Bowling, it wasn't really suitable for crop farming. So it ended up, by the late 17th century, divided into closes, which were sort of small holdings for livestock farming instead, which I suppose is typical, really. because if you think of like the Western Yorkshire Dales, which is very hilly, being in the Pennines, it's all cattle farming. There's very, very little in the way of agriculture instead. So, we then go from it being a very, very pretty picture to a perhaps not so pretty picture, the urbanisation of the area. So it started to change in the last decade of the 18th century, and that's because most of Broomfields fell within the Bowling Township and under the Lord of the Bowling Manor, and he started to sink coal mines in the area. So it basically started to get dug up and changed anyway. And once you start doing that and you essentially spoil an area that was beautiful before, you start thinking about, well, maybe it's not that beautiful anymore anyway, we could just build other things in the area and use it for other things. This is near the bottom of Hall Lane where it meets Wakefield Road. I think there's still a post office right at the end. These are former coal miners' houses. And the Broomfields Colliery was at the junction of Hall Lane and Wakefield Road. But for quite a while, despite the coal mining in the area, it did continue to be rural, and that was because what was going on with the Industrial Revolution in other respects, with wool textiles, was happening elsewhere in Bradford at that time. But by 1840, mills were built along the Bowling Beck to the west. A tramway was built through Broomfields by Bowling Iron Works. So you started to get more things being developed in the area. So you start putting up mills and factories, dye works, iron works, mines. You need houses for your workforce. So they started to build worker houses in the area. And then the perhaps more significant thing that started to happen was the railways appeared in the area. So the 1846, the West Riding Junction Railway was started, and 1854 Adolphus Street Station was built, which used to be the other side of just the other side of Wakefield Road, from what I gather. Wasn't really a very successful station. I think people didn't like getting off there and having to walk into town from there. You know, the Exchange station later was much more successful. You then got further industry coming to the area because the railways were there. So you got sidings being built. And then again, because you get more industry in the area, you need more worker housing in the area, so there's more houses are put up. So within 25 years, about 1,500 houses had been built, and 65 cellar dwellings. So the cellar dwellings were basically, from what I gather, were houses with cellars, but people actually used to live in the cellars, which was quite characteristic of the Broomfields area. After that, there wasn't really much land left for building anything on. Everything was being taken up. St Dunstan's Station was built in Broomfields in 1878. So if you go up the railway from Bradford Interchange, as though you're going out either towards Leeds or towards Halifax, you get to a Y junction, where it goes in one direction or it goes in the other. So the idea, building the train station there, was rather than having to catch, you want to go and change trains to then go on the other line. So rather than having to catch a train and go all the way into the Exchange station, you could get off at St Dunstan's instead, and you could change trains there and then get back on another service. To the south of St Dunstan's, a third line was built. So you had one line that went to Lacerdale, one line that went to Queensbridge. So this actually linked the two. Now, I think, was this the Bradford avoiding line? Is that?
When I was in the freight line, like
Freight line only, yeah. Okay.
So I think it went off towards the Leeds line.
So it basically allowed freight trains to avoid having to come into Bradford Exchange, which makes sense because they'd have to go in and then they'd have to come back out the opposite way, rather than this way they'd loop round, I guess. Yes, so a level crossing was built further up. I can't remember the line itself, although it was still in existence when I was a boy, but I do remember walking down here and although the line seemed to have gone on the road, it looked as though there were elements of it on each side, and it was quite a long time from what I remember before they actually put any sort of barriers up on each side. So I suppose one of the things that perhaps doesn't get said enough in the books I've read is that railways had an enormous impact on the development of Broomfields. So if the railways hadn't been built in that particular area, it would have been very different. I imagine it would have still ended up developed because of the Industrial Revolution coming to Bradford, but the way that it happened and how intensely it happened, I think, was all down to the rail lines that were constructed in the area. You basically, if you lived in Broomfields, I imagine you would have just been surrounded by rail lines. So just to give you an idea of how radically it changed. So this is a map in 1831 of the area. So you can see there's the collieries from mining, the Lady Well, there's a corn mill, but there isn't really much otherwise in the area. It's very underdeveloped. So this is basically all going to be fields and plants. 1854. Okay, so there's still some gaps where there hasn't been development, but there's quite a lot of development that's started to happen, and it's particularly starting to happen around where there are roads already, or near where the railway lines are starting to be built. 1861. It's more of a profile of houses, and these are back-to-back terraced houses that are being built. 1871. You've had Ripleyville as well started to be built at the bottom. The Ripleyville I'm not really covering today. I've got a separate talk about Ripleyville in the new year. And then 1893, and it's it's pretty packed by then. There isn't really much breathing space, I would say, in the area. It's really become intensely developed. Now, it's not just Broomfields in isolation, so you can see the railway lines that are over here, which is sort of going towards sort of Birksland, New Leeds area, and then this side, there's a lot more houses developed as well, sort of Lower Manchester Road area. But yeah, Broomfields is really, really densely packed by that point. So, we're talking about housing, we're talking about industry, but what about the people that actually lived there? So, by 1880 there was about 8,000 people, and as I said before, they're squeezed into quite a small area. Now, there wasn't any building control or proper planning at that time. And this was all over Bradford. You needed worker houses. They got built quickly and as cheaply as possible, and that often meant that they weren't that structurally well built. You didn't really get structural engineers doing surveys and plans back then. There wasn't any real basic sanitation or water that was drinkable, not that you'd want to drink anyway. So there were problems. This is common across all these neighbourhoods at this time. When we talked about Longlands last week, it was exactly the same. In fact, it was worse in Longlands than it was in Broomfields. Back-to-back terraced houses were most of the housing, one up and one down. A lot had cellar dwellings as well, so you got families living in the cellars. and there was overcrowding. Overwhelmingly, the area was working class. About 8,000 residents, you only had about 60 people who were sort of middle class, sort of managerial grade jobs. Again, it's not untypical of most of the neighbourhoods. There was a large Irish population. Now, from what I've read, although it was still a significant population, when you compare it with other places in Bradford, particularly this end of Bradford, it was much smaller. And from what I can gather, it was about a fifth of the population overall. That might not be entirely accurate, and I suppose it depends on when we're talking about. But for instance, up here, so Longlands that we talked about last week, and Silsbridge Lane and Gortyside, which I'm going to talk about this afternoon, that was practically 100% Irish Catholic that lived around it, and White Abbey as well, across the way. There were a lot of, so this is not just houses, this is actually a working, functioning community with shops. People's lives were very, very local, you know, so there was, like I say here, a shop on every street. 1912 Smith's Directory lists 37 shops and pubs on Hall Lane, and that's just one part of the Broomfields area. And that's again not very untypical of all of these neighbourhoods. You get butchers, greengrocers, general stores, you get pubs, and blacksmiths and so on. So these places weren't just lots and lots of housing, they were also businesses to serve the populations of those places. And I would say as a consequence of that, because people would obviously meet one another in shops and in pubs, there would have been more of a sense of community identity and spirit. You know, the chances are more neighbours would have known one another than perhaps is the case today. And then 1880, Bowling Park was built up the hill at the bottom of East Bowling. I sort of see Bowling Park as being in between West Bowling and East Bowling, really.
No man's land.
It's a no man's land, yeah. It's just bowling. But because of the proximity, it's fair to say that, you know, people who lived in Broomfields would have spent a lot of time there when they could, you know. Not that they would have had a lot of leisure time, because people's working weeks would have been so long. But it was, you know, it was an amenity that was there on their doorstep. And the other thing was that Broomfields had one of the first cinemas in Bradford, the Picturedrome, which was at the corner of Croft Street and Wakefield Road. I think it's more or less where the Bedford Arms was, in that corner.
Lower down to City.
Ah, right.
Bedford.
Okay.
Changed its name to Astra.
Right. And I think...
Pull down.
Right, well, one of its nicknames was Bugs Alley. I think you were very lucky if you went and didn't get bit by fleas when you were in there. So, one point is that overcrowding in the houses was almost essential, because the rents that were charged in the area were extortionate. So families had to club together in order to afford a home. And yeah, as I said before, you had overcrowding, lack of basic sanitation, so you had disease, high infant mortality rates, you had poverty. There was no security as well. I mean, I think a lot of people, particularly in the 19th century in the area, would have paid almost like a daily amount to the landlord for the right to sleep in the house, and sometimes people would have just ended up sleeping on the floor. So if you couldn't then afford the rent the next day, you were out in the streets, basically. Not good. So 1870, Bradford Corporation passes a bylaw which sets minimum street widths, and effectively that's supposed to ban further back-to-back terraced houses. It's supposed to start moving us towards through terraced houses, although I'm not quite sure how much this was actually enforced in practice. One of the problems, which we actually talked about last week with Longlands and was that there were landlords and property interests who were members of the council. So, and back then, you know, it was perfectly acceptable and perfectly legal to have conflicts of interest and vote against things that would you know, might mean that the council was going to compulsorily purchase your property, you know, because you didn't want that to happen, you know, as where today, if a councillor did that, they would very quickly end up in prison, and quite rightly. So there was a lot, despite the conditions in the area, there was a lot of resistance to declaring the area unsanitary, which would have then given the council powers to slum clear the area under the Housing of the Working Classes Act. So it was a slum, but it was one of a number of slums that had developed around central Bradford at that point. So it was, in many respects, no different to, you know, the neighbouring areas. Now, I'm going to go off slightly off tangent here and talk about Bolton Park, simply because I touched on it earlier, and although it's not quite in Broomfields, it's nearly in Broomfields, and I think it will have had a big impact on people in Broomfields. A lot of people will have walked up to the park and used the park. Now, I grew up in Biley, and I think Bolton Park was basically the nearest public park to where I lived, and I think you had to walk down to Oakenshaw otherwise, which was a fair trek really. It was much easier to go to bowling. So I do remember it as a kid, and how much it changed as I was growing up as well. And I always thought, quite naively, that bowling park was something to do with Bowling Hall, because quite often, you would get a public park that had originally been the grounds of a manor house. But that's not true. It never was. And also, the other thing is that often when a park becomes a public park, it's not quite owned by the council, it's held in trust by the council. So for instance, Peel Park was left to the people of Bolton, that area. And so it's now held in trust by Bradford Council. And if Bradford Council ever decided that they didn't want to carry on running the park, they'd have to find a charity to basically take over running it. It cannot be sold, and it's not really directly the property of the council. The council has a duty to look after it. Now, the difference with Bowling Park is it's actually directly owned by Bradford Council. So the area had been used for coal mining, for ironstone extraction. So basically, it was a bit of a wasteland, actually. But in the 1870s, Bradford Council purchased the land from the former Bowling Township, and they, it did include some parts of the grounds of Bowling Hall, but most of it wasn't. So they decided they wanted to actually do something with this pretty ugly patch of land. And in 1878, the council opened up a competition to design a new public park for the area. So you got lots of different architects' practices, designers who came up with their own designs and visions for what this park should be, what should be called, what should be included in it. And those that won were a practice called Kershaw and Hepworth, who were based in Brighouse. So they won, and although most of what they proposed in their design was actually implemented in the end, there were some bits the council didn't do. So Kershaw and Hepworth wanted a croquet lawn, they wanted a cricket ground, they wanted a reservoir.
See where they were coming from.
That never happened. 1880, the park was finally opened, and the Mayor of Bradford formally opened it. And you had decorative park gates, you had a lodge, you had a bandstand. There's quite a lot of stuff that actually survived for a long time. Victorian greenhouse, people remember that?
Yes,
Yeah.
yes.
There was what do you call it where you keep birds? Aviary. I mean, that's gone now, isn't it? It's been torn down, and it was such a shame. I do remember as a a youngster wandering around that with my parents and being pretty amazed by it. Yeah. There was also an outdoor ponds, paddling pool, flower gardens, a drinking fountain. So yeah, some historians, they regard this as being, there was a lot of sort of more middle and upper class people who felt that the working classes were a bit, how can we say? I don't think that touches it really.
Oh, doesn't it?
No, I think probably decadent, anarchistic, uncivilized, you know. And it was alcohol. Alcohol was such a big problem, you know. People basically went to you know, beer houses and pubs, and so there was a lot of we need to persuade the working classes to start looking at other things, you know. And parks were seen as a non-alcoholic recreation. Yes, so because of this not very positive view that the authorities, and I suppose you could accurately call the ruling classes, had of the working class. So you open up a public park, but you can't just let people in. You have to have a strict set of rules. So there were bylaws that were passed regulating the park. So the bylaws. So there were opening and closing times. So if you were caught outside of those times in the park, you could potentially be arrested if it was a policeman. You weren't allowed to play football in the park. You couldn't have public meetings in the park. Well, you know, revolution, and, you know. You weren't allowed to take dogs in. That, I really don't like that. I have a dog, and there are beaches which I can't take the dog on.
Yeah,
So,
but there'd be pulling everywhere then. It's not like it is today when you pick up your phone, would you?
I suppose.
Well, that's all by the deal.
Yeah, well, yeah, I think everybody should be responsible.
Yeah.
You weren't allowed to drink alcohol in the park.
Of course.
You're probably not allowed to drink alcohol in the park now, actually.
No.
You prohibited unseemly behaviour. And you weren't allowed to stand on the grass.
Keep off the grass.
Yes. So, you know, this is a public amenity for the community, but you have to follow the rules, and won't be tied if you break any of them. I'm not quite sure it's like that anymore.
No.
So just finishing off about Bowling Park. So there were, during the First World War, the Bradford Pals used it as a temporary base. Yeah, there's a photograph there of them. In the 20s, bowling greens, tennis courts and a new promenade were added. I remember the bowling green a lot, wandering nearby, and the tennis courts as well. I never played in the tennis courts. They were sort of up at the top end of the park. They got into a really dilapidated state, I remember, at one point. Later in the 20th century, the ponds were filled in, and I don't think there are any left now. And the golf links was later added, and that again was sort of the top end. You're almost at Bowling Cemetery, that end of the park. Okay, so back to Broomfields. So depopulation and rebuilding. So in the early 20th century, Bradford Corporation began slum clearances, and last week we talked about the Longlands area, and that being the first small-scale slum clearance that there was in Bradford, after a lot of resistance from property interests on the council. So there were plans for a crossrail in Bradford. There was an Act of Parliament passed to link essentially to link Bradford Exchange with, I think it was Bradford Market Street, now Bradford Foster Square station. So you would be able to then have trains that would run from, say, Manchester to Carlisle or something like that through the centre of Bradford. There were various different options as to how they would do it. Anyway, after the First World War, the whole scheme fell through. Basically, there was no money around after the war. So Bradford Corporation bought the land up that was in the Broomfields area off the Midland Railway Company, and decided they would do other things with it instead, because from their point of view, Crossrail was dead. And this area became the focus for the beginning of urban regeneration in the area. So you got Bowling Road built, and it's quite odd really, because it's a dual carriageway. And the idea was that this area was going to be the beginning, I suppose a little bit like a high street for that area, to regenerate it. But the plans never really came to any fruition. I think, again, just as the railway companies didn't have any money after the war, the local councils didn't have any money either. Now, there were other plans later on that affected this road. Does anybody have any idea what they were? They never came to fruition. Okay, do you know the M606 motorway?
We were looking down through West Broomfields on it.
So it originally was going to go all the way from the M62 into the city centre. That was the idea, and it would have come down here. So they would have actually made use of Bowling Road, because it was already a dual carriageway. And then it would have ended up, I'm not quite sure how it would have finished when it got to the bottom of Wakefield Road and Croft Street, but it would have finished then. The idea was to link the motorway with the Shipley Airedale Road. But of course, again, it was a whether people were for it or against it ended up getting. Anyway, on completion of the road, they started slum clearance programme in Broomfields. So this is into war. They didn't quite finish it, though, from what I can gather. So nearly all the original housing was beginning to be demolished. So most of it was declared unsafe. And 52 new council houses were built between Rousefold and Hall Lane. From what I understand, most of the Broomfields residents were rehomed in Canterbury, in the new Canterbury estate at Little Hawton. So it was a bit like with Longlands, we talked about last week, the Faxfleet estate near Marshfields and Bankfoot. That was built for the Longlands residents to be moved to whilst they were clearing Longlands and rebuilding it. And similarly, Canterbury was essentially built for residents of Broomfields to move to whilst they were clearing the area. And like with Faxfleet, not everybody came back again afterwards. A lot of people stayed living in the new estate. So then we hadn't had enough having one war. We had to have another world war, and that obviously interrupted everything. So afterwards, 60 prefab houses were put up on cleared land in Broomfields. And then in the 50s, Bradford Council adopted a plan, a Bradford Development Plan, which assigned most of Broomfields to light industrial use. So we now have this very peculiar situation where you have mostly industrial and commercial premises in the area, but then you've got these houses clustered around Hall Lane and Prospect Street, which is, in my mind, an area should really either be residential or it should be commercial. It should be one or the other. So I'm not entirely sure what it must be like for people who do live in these houses now, and what they must feel about the area. I found it very difficult actually getting anybody who currently lives in the area to talk to us while we were doing the research for this. What we did find was that most residents nowadays don't stay in the area for very long. Nearly everybody rents, and they might stay there for 6 months or 12 months because they've got a job in Bradford, and then they probably move on. Even if they're still working in Bradford, they'll probably find somewhere else to move to. So nobody starts to build roots, starts to get to know their neighbours. It's more really just an area of housing around that area than a community, which is a shame. Right, so the other point to make is that after the railways came to the area and shaped the area, they began to retreat from the area. So you still have railways in the area, but not half as many as there used to be. So, as I said earlier, the Crossrail project was abandoned. Adolphus Street Station was, and that was actually closed to passengers very early on in its life, 1867, because the Bradford Exchange Station was far more popular with people to get off there than to get off and have to walk down Wakefield Road. But it still remained open until 1972, and it was used for freight and parcels. But then it's gone. I think it's just a grassy area now, more or less, around that area. St Dunstan Station was closed in 1952, and I understand it was demolished soon afterwards. The line at Hall Lane Crossing has now gone. It was finally removed in 1985. And then, arguably, I would say the depopulation of the area has resulted in a decline of the area. So that's what was the Mill Lane pub. But as you can see there, the car's gone, the signage has gone. Sadly, it's closed. It's a bit of an awkward place, really. But the thing is, there are other pubs in Bradford which are in awkward places, like the Fighting Cock in Lisson Hills, and yet it still thrives. It's a bit of a mecca for real ale people. It was never really that sort of pub, though, from what I gather. Just a pub. So there is a shop and there's a cafe at what used to be the bowling hotel, or near the bowling hotel at that end. But arguably, their clientele is people who work in the area rather than people who live in the area, I would say. So it's businesses. It's like when you get cafes springing up on industrial estates and stuff like that. You know, people go somewhere at lunchtime. By the turn of the century, there was only 3 pubs. So there was this one, the Mill Lane, the Bowling Hotel, and the Bedford Arms at the bottom of Wakefield Road. But they've all now closed. So there are actually a grand total of no pubs. And from what we gather, nearly all the housing in Broomfields is now private landlord owned. I assumed it would all stay within Bradford Council or in communities, which now runs the social housing. But apparently Omar Khan, you know Omar Khan of the Curry House, he also has property interests and he owns most of the housing in Broomfields now. So most of the people that live there are his tenants. And as I said before, the population is mostly transient as a result of that. So, I'm going to stop talking now and ask if anybody got any questions, or has anybody got anything they would like to share about this?